Imagine waking up to find out that your province just got cast as the main character in Canada's geopolitical comeback story. That's essentially what happened to British Columbia this week when Premier David Eby stood up and declared that BC is about to become the economic engine of a brand new world order. And no, this isn't the plot of a Netflix political thriller, this is actual Canadian politics in 2025, where Prime Minister Mark Carney is out here in Davos basically announcing that the global system is breaking apart and Canada's response is to throw $1 trillion at the problem while BC positions itself as the gateway to economic survival. Welcome to Canadian Insights, where we turn political speeches into something you actually want to pay attention to, and trust me, you're going to want to hear this one because it involves global ruptures, trillion-dollar investments, and a premier who thinks his province is about to save the entire Canadian economy while simultaneously throwing shade at anyone who wants to mess with Indigenous partnerships. Let's set the scene. Mark Carney is in Davos, Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum, which is basically where global elites gather annually to discuss important things while skiing and drinking expensive wine. And Carney gets up there and drops what can only be described as a geopolitical truth bomb. He tells everyone that what we're experiencing isn't a transition, it's a rupture. The old world order, the rules-based international system that's been holding things together since World War II, it's fading. We're entering an era of great power rivalry where, and this is a direct quote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That's not exactly sunshine and rainbows diplomacy, that's Carney basically saying the playground bully is back and smaller countries need to figure out their survival strategy real quick. And what's Canada's response to this cheerful assessment of global affairs? Fast-tracking $1 trillion of investment in energy, artificial intelligence, and critical minerals while desperately trying to diversify trade relationships because apparently putting all your economic eggs in the American basket isn't looking like such a great idea anymore. Gee, who could have seen that coming? It's almost like relying entirely on one trading partner might leave you vulnerable when that partner starts talking about annexation and throwing around tariff threats like confetti at a Canada Day parade. But here's where it gets interesting. Because while Carney's painting this picture of global chaos and Canadian reinvention, David Eby is sitting in British Columbia going yes, this, exactly this, and also we're going to be the stars of this show. Eby says he listened to Carney's speech with relief and pride. Relief because finally someone at the federal level is saying what needs to be said and charting the course that needs to be charted. Pride because Eby genuinely believes BC is going to play the key role in whatever new economic reality Canada is building. That's not just provincial boosterism. That's a premier basically declaring that his province is about to become essential to national survival. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's great David, but what exactly makes British Columbia so special in this brave new world? And that's actually a fair question that has a pretty compelling answer. Geography, baby. BC has something that Ontario and Quebec and the prairies don't have, and that's coastline on the Pacific Ocean. And in a world where Canada is trying to reduce dependence on the United States and build stronger relationships with Asian markets, having ports and infrastructure facing Asia suddenly becomes incredibly valuable. It's like owning beachfront property when everyone else is landlocked. Sure, your neighbors have nice houses, but you're the one with ocean access and that changes everything. Eby was making these comments at the BC Natural Resources Forum in Prince George, which is not coincidentally a resource-heavy region that stands to benefit enormously if BC really does become this economic engine he keeps talking about. And he wasn't just talking theory, he was connecting dots between Carney's Davos speech and his own recent trade trip to India. Because India, in case you haven't noticed, is kind of a big deal. Most populous country in the world, massive economic growth projected for the coming decades, and desperately needs reliable supplies of metals and minerals to fuel that growth. And guess who has metals and minerals and Pacific access to ship them? That's right, British Columbia. Eby sees this as BC's huge opportunity, positioning the province as the supplier of critical resources to the fastest-growing major economy on the planet. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, or I guess the eagle, since we're talking about Canada-US relations. Eby acknowledged that Carney's speech, which was pretty clearly positioning Canada as independent from and even potentially at odds with American interests, is going to have consequences for the Canada-US relationship. You can't go to an international forum and basically announce you're building a new world order because the old one is breaking down without your largest trading partner taking notice. But here's Eby's take, and honestly it's pretty bold. He says yeah, there will be trade consequences, but those are minimal compared to the long-term consequences of giving up Canadian sovereignty and not standing up for our country the way Canadians have for generations. That's not diplomatic hedging, that's a premier saying some things are more important than avoiding short-term economic pain, and national sovereignty is one of them. This ties directly into EB's comments about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which has become a political football in BC. Some opponents want it repealed, arguing it creates uncertainty and slows down resource development. EB is saying the exact opposite. He's arguing that repealing it would create chaos, invite court challenges, and make BC less attractive for investment at precisely the moment when Canada cannot afford economic uncertainty. According to EB, projects worth tens of billions of dollars would stop immediately if BC stopped working in partnership with First Nations, because those nations would file injunctions based on their constitutionally protected title rights. Section 35, he specifically cites, which recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights. And this is where EB's vision gets really interesting because he's essentially arguing that Indigenous partnerships aren't obstacles to economic development, they're essential components of it. The idea that you could move faster or create more jobs by cutting First Nations out of the process is, in his words, false and destructive. This isn't just progressive politics, this is practical economics. If you want to build mines, pipelines, LNG facilities, any major resource project in BC, you need Indigenous consent or you're going to spend years tied up in litigation. So partnership isn't a nice to have, it's a must have if you actually want to get anything done. Let's zoom back out to the bigger picture here because what we're really watching is British Columbia trying to position itself as essential to Canadian economic strategy at a moment of genuine global uncertainty. Carney's talking about ruptures and great power rivalry and the fading of the rules-based order. That's not normal political speech, that's acknowledgement that the global system is fundamentally changing and countries need to adapt or get left behind. And EB is saying BC is ready, willing, and able to be at the forefront of that adaptation because of geography, resources, and relationships with both Asian markets and Indigenous nations. But there's also a subtle dig happening here that's worth noting. When EB talks about relief that the Prime Minister is finally saying what needs to be said and charting the course that needs to be charted, there's an implication that this hasn't been happening consistently. EB's basically saying thank goodness someone at the federal level is stepping up, which suggests he doesn't think previous leadership was doing enough. It's support, but it's support with a slight edge, which is very on brand for provincial-federal relations in Canada where everyone's technically on the same team but also constantly jockeying for position and credit. The $1 trillion Carney mentioned is also worth unpacking because that's an absolutely massive number. Canada's entire GDP is around $2 trillion, so we're talking about investment equal to half of annual economic output going into energy, AI, and critical minerals. That's not tinkering around the edges, that's a fundamental restructuring of the Canadian economy. And if even a fraction of that flows through BC, EB's right to be excited because it would transform the provincial economy. New mines, new processing facilities, new infrastructure, new jobs, new tax revenue, the works. This is the kind of investment that changes a province's trajectory for generations. Of course, there's a gap between announced plans and actual implementation that could fit several mountain ranges, which BC coincidentally has plenty of. Saying you're going to fast-track $1 trillion of investment is one thing, actually doing it is substantially harder, especially in a country that's not exactly known for swift project approvals and construction timelines. Canada is great at many things, speed is not traditionally one of them. So there's legitimate skepticism about whether all this grand vision actually translates into shovels in the ground and products being shipped. And then there's the question of what happens if the global situation changes again. We're making all these plans based on the assumption that Asian markets will continue growing and demanding Canadian resources, that the US-Canada relationship will remain strained enough to justify diversification, that Indigenous partnerships will hold strong, that investments will actually materialize. Any of those assumptions could shift, and then the whole strategy needs recalibration. International relations is not a static game, it's constantly evolving, and what looks like brilliant positioning today might look short-sighted 5 years from now. But you know what? For the moment, EB's playing the hand he's got, and he's playing it pretty aggressively. He's tying BC's economic future to a broader national and international narrative about global reordering and Canadian resilience. He's positioning the province as essential, not peripheral. He's defending Indigenous partnerships as economically necessary, not just morally right. And he's doing all of this while the world watches whether Canada can actually pull off this pivot away from total US dependence toward a more diversified, Pacific-oriented economic strategy. What's remarkable about this moment is that it represents a pretty significant shift in how Canadian politicians talk about the world. For decades, the assumption was that the international rules-based order was stable, that trade would keep expanding, that multilateral institutions would keep functioning, that Canada could be a middle power that benefits from global stability without having to do too much heavy lifting. Carney's speech throws all of that out the window. He's saying the order is rupturing, middle powers need to build something new, and Canada needs to get serious about its own economic sovereignty and strategic positioning. That's a fundamentally different worldview, and EB is enthusiastically signing on. So here we are, with a Prime Minister in Davos declaring the old world order dead and a BC Premier announcing his province is ready to be the star of whatever comes next. It's ambitious, it's bold, and honestly it's kind of refreshing to hear Canadian politicians talk with this level of clarity about the challenges ahead instead of just pretending everything's fine while the world changes around us. Whether it actually works, whether BC really does become this economic engine, whether Canada successfully navigates great power rivalry and builds meaningful new partnerships, all of that remains to be seen. But at least someone's acknowledging reality and proposing a plan, which is more than we often get. Alright, if you made it this far you clearly care about where Canada is heading and what role different provinces are going to play in our economic future. Make sure you're subscribed to Canadian Insights because we're covering all of this as it develops, multiple videos a day breaking down the politics, the economics, and the personalities shaping this country. Hit that like button if you think EB's right about BC's potential or if you think he's overhyping it. I genuinely want to know what you think. Drop a comment with your take. Is British Columbia really about to become Canada's economic engine or is this just a premier talking up his province? Let's discuss it. I'll see you in the next one, and trust me, with everything happening in Canadian politics right now, there's always something new to talk about.